Now we switch to a completely different topic, the opioid crisis in the US. Luckily, we do not have such a crisis here in Germany, but we now will hear what we could learn from this disaster in the US and some other countries about the mechanisms of cannabis, and therefore I'm very happy to welcome Ziva from the US.
Great, so it's wonderful to be here. I'd like to thank the program committee for inviting me. This is my first IACM meeting, and for me, I was trained as a preclinical pharmacologist, and then about 10 years ago, I started looking at human pharmacology using controlled laboratory studies to understand the pharmacology of cannabis and cannabinoids. So for me, this meeting is an ideal blend of preclinical science and clinical practice. So it's been a wonderful meeting thus far, and thank you for indulging me in talking about a US-centric issue, although it's clear that it is spreading to other areas of the world. So the data I'll be talking about is based off of studies that were funded by the NIH, but I do receive other research funds as well as being on the scientific advisory board for FSD Pharma. So in the United States, there's not a week that goes by where there's not some editorial or some piece in a very large news source that discusses the idea that cannabis and cannabinoids might help to alleviate the opioid epidemic. So we're really being bombarded with this idea. The public is being bombarded with this idea that cannabis might actually help to alleviate the opioid epidemic. So what's the reason for this media over-enthusiasm? In part, pain is the #1 reason for why people are using medical cannabis in the United States. So there's this idea that cannabis might actually substitute for opioids. There's perceived efficacy of cannabis and cannabinoids for pain, and I'll talk about the rigorous studies that support this idea. There have been several reports that have demonstrated that people are able to decrease their opioid use, both pain patients and people that are suffering from opioid use disorder when they use cannabis. There's interesting state-level findings that suggest that in states that allow medical cannabis, there's a reduction in adverse effects related to opioids. And interestingly, 4 states in the United States have now legalized the use of medicinal cannabis for opioid use disorder. So what is the evidence behind the hype? And I hope to go through evidence ranging from preclinical to rigorous studies, sharing with you the evidence for cannabis and cannabis constituents supporting their use in the context of this opioid epidemic. So some brief background, I'll talk a little bit about the opioid epidemic, I'll talk about the evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for pain, and then I'll talk about constituents as a potential substitute or adjunct to opioids for pain relief. So in the United States, many of you know this, that there's been an increasing rise in number of fatalities related to opioids. So in 2017, there were 50,000 opioid overdoses. That means that in the United States, 150 deaths per million related to opioid overdoses. Now, the US isn't alone in this. Other parts of the world have also experienced increases in overdose. So the UK, Australia, and Canada have all witnessed increases in opioid overdoses. And you can see that, especially in Canada, this is a really serious issue. In the US, 30% of opioid overdoses are due to prescription opioids. And it's been estimated that 12% of people prescribed opioids for pain develop an opioid use disorder. This is really important to know because opioids, as many of you know in the US, are regularly prescribed. So as a woman who just had 2 babies in the last 3 years, I came home with a full 7-day supply of opioids, despite the fact that I didn't use any in the hospital. They just sent them home with me, and they're just sitting in my cabinet right now. I'm not the only one who gets prescribed opioids. You go in for a toothache, you get an opioid. What's interesting now is that with respect to the people who are using heroin, it's been noted that 80% of these people first started off with prescription opioids in the United States. So it is clear that there's an urgent need to reduce prescription opioid reliance, get them out of the system to help prevent some of the downstream effects. So is there potential for cannabis and cannabinoids to help alleviate our reliance on opioids? So first, I'd like to talk about the evidence from rigorous randomized controlled studies looking at cannabis and cannabinoids as effective analgesics. So this has already been touched on over the last day and a half. The National Academies of Sciences put out a consensus report, and there are some committee members in the audience, Dr. Piamelli over there, and we looked at the evidence supporting the effectiveness of cannabis and cannabinoids for 20 of the most common indications for which they can be used in the United States. And what we found is that there was substantial evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for chronic pain. These conclusions were based off of 40 rigorous studies, so randomized controlled studies, 31 of which were using either synthetic cannabinoids, so dronabinol or nabilone, or cannabis-derived cannabinoids, so Sativex. Only 9 of these studies were done with actual cannabis. And this cannabis, by the way, primarily had THC, very minimal amounts of cannabidiol. All 40 of these studies looked at cannabis and cannabinoids as adjunct medications. So to my knowledge, there has not been a single study yet in a patient population looking at the utility of cannabis or cannabinoids alone to help treat pain. And only one of these studies compared the cannabinoid to an opioid, and that study did not have positive findings. So while we have a great body of evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for chronic pain, there are a lot of holes, especially with respect to this idea if cannabis or cannabinoids can serve as a substitute or adjunct to opioids for pain. So today I'll talk about the evidence supporting the utility of THC, cannabidiol, and 2 individual terpenes that are of interest to me right now. So we know that the CB1 receptor, one of the primary targets of THC, has overlapping neuroanatomical distribution with the mu-opioid receptor. And some of these sites are very important for pain processing. We know that there's overlapping signal transduction pathways between the mu-opioid receptor as well as the CB1 receptor. And we know that there are overlapping pharmacological effects. Mu-opioid receptor agonists as well as CB1 receptor agonists both produce anti-nociception or pain relief in animals. We know that there's ample evidence demonstrating that cannabinoids, well, CB1 receptor agonists and mu-opioid receptor agonists, so opioids, when given together can produce a synergistic effect. And when I talk about synergy, this is what I mean. We know that THC in a rodent will help to reduce pain. With increasing doses, you can see that THC decreases a pain response in a variety of pain assays. However, this analgesia, or this anti-nociception, also comes with profound effects at the central nervous system, so adverse effects, cognition, memory, locomotor activity, intoxication. We also know that opioids reduce pain, but they also clearly have side effects. What's interesting is that when you give a very small dose of THC or a CB1 receptor agonist that does not have effects in the brain or does not have intoxicating effects or effects on cognition, and a dose of an opioid that also doesn't have effects, behavioral effects, and doesn't produce analgesia on its own, when you give them together, you actually see decreased pain response and you see decreased side effects. So decreased intoxication, decreased decrements in learning. So there's robust preclinical evidence for cannabinoid-opioid synergy. When we look at state-level data in the United States, and the United States, I'm choosing data from the United States just because it's been studied already repeatedly. So there's really interesting data that does seem to support decreases in prescription opioid use in medical cannabis states. In 2014, there was a compelling study that was published showing that in medical cannabis states, there was reduced opioid fatalities. Since then, we know that this has not borne out. So a recent study in 2019 shows that this is no longer in effect, although there has been some disputes over which data set is more reliable. We also know that in medical cannabis states, there's apparently decreases in opioid prescribing. When you ask people, or when you're looking at observational data or tracking people over time, some medical cannabis users report that they're able to decrease their opioid use over time. So specifically, people that are using medicinal cannabis for pain, they are reporting repeatedly that they can actually reduce their opioid use over time. However, if you look at some 4-year longitudinal studies, there was a study that came out of Australia, the opposite was shown, where people with chronic pain who turned to medicinal cannabis for help actually showed increases in pain over time and increases in opioid use. So what's going on here? We have robust preclinical evidence demonstrating that there's cannabinoid opioid synergy. However, we have really mixed findings from population and state level. So how can we suss this out? How can we figure out if cannabinoids can actually interact with opioids such that we can reduce our reliance on opioids and maybe decrease the adverse effects? And so this is where we come in. In order to bridge the preclinical findings to these large state epidemiological findings, or self-report, we use the controlled human laboratory. The controlled human laboratory is able to probe pharmacological aspects of cannabis and cannabinoids under very controlled conditions, and they can serve as proof of concept. So you'll see that for these particular studies, we're not using pain patients. We're not using cannabis-naive people. We're actually using people that use cannabis regularly. And this is a very controlled environment where we look at the impact of cannabis and cannabinoids under double-blind, placebo-controlled conditions. And we can look at both the therapeutic effects, so in this respect, we're looking at pain-relieving effects, as well as the adverse effects that we have already heard about are so important in determining the clinical utility of cannabis and cannabinoids. In the United States, and I'm getting the gist that this is the case elsewhere, these studies are actually a regulatory nightmare. So they take a very long time to get off the ground. We have several different regulatory bodies that oversee this work. So it's an immense amount of work to get going, but I think you'll see, based on the importance of these data, that it's worth the time, it's worth the effort. So for these studies, I'm looking at pain response induced by something called a cold pressor test. The cold pressor test is a very economical way to look at a pain response in people. You take 2 ice buckets, and you have one filled with warm water, where people put their hand in for 3 minutes to normalize their temperature, and then another one with ice. And all you do is you ask people to put their hand in the ice bucket, and you say, tell me when you first feel pain, and we record that time, and that's called pain threshold. And then when you can no longer stand it, pull your hand out. Now you can see here that an important component is the fact that the experimenter is the same sex as the research participant. So it's very important to control for this. You might imagine what would happen if the participant was a male and the research assistant was a female. You might get skewed results. So today I'm going to talk about the pain threshold, so latency to report pain. What's nice about this cold pressor test is that it has predictive validity for analgesics that are used in the clinic to help treat chronic pain. So other analgesic agents that are used to help chronic pain show a positive signal in this test. Another nice thing about this design is that I use every person as their own control. So every person is tested with all the different drug conditions. So it doesn't really matter if Mary's pain response at baseline differs from Jim's response at baseline, because I'm comparing Mary to Mary and Jim to Jim. So this gives us exquisite statistical power to be able to detect the impact of different drug conditions on pain response. So for this particular study, we had participants inhale cannabis with a measly 5.6% THC. They got an equivalent of about 35 milligrams THC in this study. And I looked at this cannabis alone, so without an opioid, and then I tested it with a very low dose of oxycodone. Oxycodone is a popularly prescribed analgesic in the United States. And what I did here was I used a sub-threshold analgesic dose of oxycodone. And the idea here was to replicate what we see in the animal laboratory, where when you combine a dose of an opioid that does not have analgesic effects on its own with cannabis, can you get a synergistic effect? Can you get a boosting of the analgesic effect, hopefully without the intoxicating effect or without the adverse effects that go along with opioids? So today I'll just talk about the analgesia, so the pain-relieving effects and intoxication. So what we found here is that when participants received cannabis, they rated their pain tolerance to be slightly higher than when they just received placebo. It wasn't statistically significant, but neither was oxycodone as expected. We tested a very low dose. We were not expecting to see analgesia with this dose. But when we looked at the two combined, we saw robust analgesia here. And so this was really nice because it replicated what we see in the animal lab. And I should say that this is actually the first evidence under double-blind placebo-controlled conditions demonstrating that when you add cannabis to an opioid, you can achieve analgesia with a dose of an opioid that is not analgesic on its own. What about intoxication? As Dr. Russo pointed out yesterday, in order for medicine to be clinically viable, we don't necessarily want intoxication. So of course, this is an important endpoint to look at. And as expected, we did find that cannabis elicited intoxication. And bear in mind, these are pretty heavy cannabis users. They're using cannabis every single day, several joints a day, and they still reported feeling high from this pretty low strength of cannabis. The opioid itself did not produce intoxication. Now, the good news is that the opioid did not further increase cannabis intoxication. But this is clearly an issue that we have to address moving forward if we want to translate what we see in the preclinical laboratory to demonstrate how cannabis or cannabinoids can be used in lieu of opioids, or if they can be used together. We want to make sure that we can minimize this adverse effect, such as intoxication. So to summarize, there's robust preclinical evidence demonstrating this cannabinoid-opioid synergy, and we have very mixed evidence from population-level data. And that's not unusual. It's very difficult to control all the different variables that are important to consider when you're looking at state-level findings or large population-level findings. What we found in our controlled human laboratory is that there does seem to be evidence that THC can reduce opioid doses. And Dr. Abrams in 2011, Donald Abrams, also demonstrated that when you add cannabis to an opioid, you can get increases in analgesia in that population. And of course, it's always important to be mindful of adverse effects. So what about CBD? We've already heard a lot about how CBD is becoming quite popular globally. People are being bombarded with all these different products. In the United States, not only are there cannabidiol-infused pillowcases, but there's cannabidiol-infused athletic wear, where the athletic wear is infused with 25 grams of cannabidiol that gets released as you go through your aerobic activity and helps to soothe muscles. So what's the evidence here that cannabidiol is helpful for pain on its own? And what's the evidence that cannabidiol might be helpful to respond to this opioid epidemic? So we know that in animal models, cannabidiol alone has been shown to reduce pain responses in a variety of pain models without those side effects that we see with THC and opioids at these analgesic doses. At this point, to my knowledge, I have not yet seen a study that has looked at CBD in combination with opioids to see if there's synergy. So I haven't seen justification for this yet. We do know, however, that there is evidence that cannabidiol can actually decrease abuse-related effects of opioids. So there does seem to be some interesting complements here between CBD and opioids. And this has been shown in animal models, as well as most recently, there was a study in humans that came out in May demonstrating that high doses of cannabidiol can reduce some symptoms associated with opioid use disorder. So the evidence thus far, it seems to support CBD potential for alleviating pain. Now, when you look at population-level data, we just don't have very much with respect to understanding how people are responding to cannabidiol, again, at a state-level, population-level data. We do know there's a lot of anecdote of people reporting that when they're using cannabidiol, it helps with pain. But we don't yet have a handle on how this is happening in the population. So anecdotal report for cannabidiol is there. It does exist for helping to reduce pain and opioid use. What about double-blind placebo-controlled studies? So this is actually really puzzling to me with all the cannabidiol that is being promoted, that there has been so little in the literature that has looked at cannabidiol alone by itself for helping to reduce pain. So there are 2 studies that I know of that looked at cannabidiol alone for pain, one of which did show a positive signal in chronic pain patients where cannabidiol was compared to THC alone as well as placebo. And the authors reported that there was an increase in pain tolerance or decrease in pain in people that were treated with cannabidiol equal to THC. And as expected, cannabidiol in this population did not produce intoxication. So at this point, there have been no studies of cannabidiol as a substitute or an adjunct to opioids for pain. Now, I do have to say that we have an exciting study underway. It's not in pain patients, but in our controlled human laboratory study, looking at the impact of cannabidiol to be able to augment opioid analgesia and intoxication. And we're looking at cannabidiol by itself, THC by itself, and the combination. So it's a really nice controlled laboratory study that will be able to shed light on cannabidiol's potential opioid-sparing effects. So to summarize, there is preclinical support for cannabidiol potential for pain. There's some anecdotal report that cannabidiol might help to reduce pain or reduce opioid use. And we actually don't really know very much about CBD alone to help for pain, at least with respect to rigorous double-blind placebo-controlled studies. And little is known about CBD's effects on opioids. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about some terpenes that are particularly of interest to me. I'll be focusing on myrcene and beta-caryophyllene. So these 2 terpenes are interesting to me because there's pretty nice evidence from the preclinical lab that these 2 terpenes actually are able to reduce pain in preclinical models. Furthermore, they're able to reduce pain, and they have minimal psychoactive effects until you get to or 10 times the dose, the analgesic dose. Then do you start seeing some behavioral effects. So there's preclinical evidence supporting terpenes' potential for pain relief. We know that beta-caryophyllene has been shown to actually act synergistically with opioids, similar to THC, such that when you give beta-caryophyllene by itself, a very low dose, with an opioid, a very low dose, you get analgesic effects, again, without those behavioral effects. Interestingly, as mentioned earlier today by Dr. Russo, beta-caryophyllene is also hypothesized to decrease abuse effects of drugs. So beta-caryophyllene might not only help to boost the analgesic effects of opioids, but also might be able to help abuse-related effects of opioids as well. It seems that myrcene and beta-caryophyllene, given the preclinical evidence for their analgesic effects in rodents, they might be able to actually work together to also reduce THC doses needed to produce analgesic effects, as well as opioid doses. And when you decrease the THC dose or the opioid dose with the combination of myrcene and beta-caryophyllene, what that means is that you're also going to reduce adverse effects. So there's preclinical support for terpenes as adjunct to THC and opioids. What about in humans? What do we know about these 2 terpenes in humans? So there was a report that came out last year demonstrating that pain patients choose cannabis types or chemovars with high myrcene and beta-caryophyllene. And 1/3 of these patients substituted cannabis for opioids over the long term. So patient-reported effects show that terpenes may indeed reduce opioid use. Of course, in those studies, those observational studies, they weren't looking at the terpenes by themselves, they were looking at the terpenes within the cannabis that those participants were using. So we're awaiting rigorous studies determining if terpenes alone or in combination with low doses of THC and opioids might actually be able to produce analgesia of clinical utility with adverse effects. And I have to say that I'm putting in a plug, hopefully, for a study that we're about to get underway. We're going through our regulatory approvals to actually look at combinations of myrcene and beta-caryophyllene with very low doses of THC and trying to understand if it can produce analgesic effects on their own or in combination of THC such that you can use low doses of THC and circumvent those intoxicating effects that I showed earlier. So to summarize, THC shows potential for pain. I'm not saying anything new here. We've already heard about this over the last 36 hours. It's safe and well tolerated. There are side effects that we have to be mindful of. And it may, in fact, reduce opioid doses in patients that are using it for pain. The CBD alone, the effects, the analgesic effects, are really unknown at this point in relation to rigorous double-blind placebo-controlled studies, although we do know that cannabidiol is safe and well tolerated with some adverse effects or some adverse effects that we should be mindful of that we just heard about. We know that terpenes may also reduce pain. Maybe it'll help reduce THC doses or opioid doses. And looking at this under a rigorously controlled study in the human laboratory will be really important to understand if what we see in preclinical models translates to humans. So to summarize, cannabis constituents, I think they do have potential to be safe strategies to reduce opioid reliance. And I think that a lot of this hinges on doing the controlled studies, being able to translate what we see in preclinical models to what can be used and implemented in the clinic or in clinical studies. So I do think that controlled studies are really important to be able to leverage the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids while also developing strategies to mitigate these adverse effects, such as cognitive impairment and intoxication. And with that, I'll take questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this brilliant overview. I've learned a lot. So I see some questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I have one small question. Even so, if you compare gym to gym, did you compare gym at the same daytime because of the cortisol levels?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. Yes. We compared Jim before he gets drug and then several time points after he gets drug at the same time of day, every single session. Well, the same time of day plus or minus 45 minutes.
Hello, Linda Klampers, Cannabis. I have two questions. So the first one is pain is of course very complex, different types of pain, etc., etc. Ethan also said that in his presentation. I was wondering how the cold pressure test in healthy volunteers could best relate to which patient population, and then. I have another question, but you can answer first what you prefer.
So that's a good question. So we're using the cold pressor test simply as a predictive model for what would be helpful to help treat chronic pain. And there have been there are other assays that you can use, other pain assays that you can use in human volunteers. That also have predictive validity. But this gives us a signal, and it's also economical, whereas the other tests are quite pricey. And what we've shown before is that this is a reliable test to look at the analgesic effects of opioids as well as cannabinoids using different modes of administration.
Yeah, thank you. And then my other question is about the Jamaican post-operative study. For the people who don't know, is where patients who just underwent an operation, there was a group of cannabis users and a group of non-cannabis users. And the cannabis users required a significant, higher amount of opioids for the same level of analgesia. We are talking, of course, about acute pain. But I was wondering how you think that might translate to chronic pain.
Yes, so this is a really important point that is developing, of course, in Los Angeles, where so many people are starting to use cannabinoids to help treat pain. And how do you manage those patients when they're going in for, let's say, long inpatient post-surgical stays? How do you manage their pain if before they come in for surgery, they are being exposed to, let's say, high levels of THC, where it's hypothesized that there might be, hyperalgesia just from not using, THC or going through withdrawal at that point. So how are you able to treat them? And at this point in time, there hasn't been good characterization of what happens to people who are using cannabinoids, who are using, I think predominantly THC before surgery or before a procedure, and understanding what happens, what's their pain response, what are the outcomes in those populations compared to populations that aren't using, let's say, THC or other cannabinoids prior to surgery. And once we identify that, figuring out pharmacological strategies to best treat the needs of that population, because it's a population that's clearly growing.
I would like to allow 4 questions, but please ask short questions and a short answer, otherwise we have to skip our break.
Yeah, I am mystified at how you can portray medical cannabis as overhyped for treatment of opioids, since it's the thing that I have found most attested over the 30 years or so. I have talked to patients, I've talked to hundreds of users who have reduced or eliminated their use of opioids, and I can tell you, I've been compiling a list of studies. There's over 24 patient surveys involving thousands of patients who report significant reductions or elimination of opioids. So I think this patient testimony needs to be taken into account.
Absolutely. My intention with that slide was to say, is this media hype? What is the evidence behind this media attention? It was not to say that this is overhyped. My intention was to set the stage and to then demonstrate or provide evidence to the audience. Thank you for pointing that out.
Again, Hans Kress from Vienna Medical University. I think you have clearly shown that the evidence, the preclinical evidence is high. The clinical evidence is poor. And the clinical evidence is poor for chronic pain. It is rather good for acute pain, and it could be shown that in acute pain, cannabinoids don't work. We have a lot of good data, and even we have data in the post-operative patient setting. It was a paper by Beaulieu, published 2006 in the Canadian Journal of Anesthesiology, showing that even the combination of opioids and nabilone, which is a CB1 agonist, doesn't work in the post-operative setting. There was another study from UK, Holdcroft, showing also. So making it clear, THC is a poor acute pain killer. And my question now is, why have you again used a test of acute pain, and the cold pressure test is clearly an acute pain setting? Why have you used an acute pain setting to test for the, in fact, not clear combination and synergistic activity of cannabinoids and opioids?
Great, so thank you for pointing this out. Again, we're using the cold pressure test as a model that has predictive validity for analgesics
But it's not a model for chronic pain. It is not a model.
I understand, but it has predictive validity for analgesics used for chronic pain. Now, in the absence of using a patient population, maybe we can talk about, other ways that we can model chronic pain in a healthy population. The idea here is to recruit a healthy population where there aren't other medications that we have to worry about with respect to pharmacological interactions or changing fluctuation in pain sensitivity between sessions.
But what we need and what we are really missing, urgently missing, is good studies in chronic pain patients under constant opioid treatment plus either placebo or THC, and that is so easy to do. It's not
It costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money, and it's hard to do, and it's hard to get funding.
Here
So
is
this is
a whole industry that could fund it.
I agree. Trust me, I am trying in the U.S. to do it. And actually, to your point, we just got a study funded looking at cannabidiol in rheumatology patients. And we are trying to expand this model to look at a patient population. Patient populations are very complex, and trying to translate what we see in preclinical models to patient populations, we want to be an intermediary step. And I think that we can be an intermediary step. We can learn a lot about basic human pharmacology from doing these studies in a non-pain population.
It is so easy to do an academic study in chronic patients that are under opioid treatment.
Great, let's talk after.
I think we all
I could
we all
use your
agree on
guidance.
this.
Thank you. Yes, and this is what we strive for. This is definitely what we strive for. But in the interim, in order to get the funding for very small studies, this is what we're doing to try and achieve that goal, for us to have some signal, some idea of what we can expect in a pain population.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tina Horsted from Denmark and pain physician. We are now doing a retrospective study for 3,200 patients that we have treated with different kind of cannabinoids, both dronabinol and cannabidiol, Bedrocan products and Cantrust product. And we are going through all these data and also looking into reduction of opioids, anticonvulsive and antidepressant, and we will be publishing this spring 2020. And I have a poster, it's number 41, and you're welcome to see.
Great, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing the data.
One last question, please.
Christoph Hotzbehoff, Citizatinium Group. I find it very interesting how you combine the different drugs, THC and opioids and terpenes, but I was wondering, have you tried a very low THC dose and a moderate CBD dose with terpenes and a very low opioid dose? I think that sounds to me like something probably rather promising.
Interesting. So in the next study, we haven't integrated cannabidiol into that mix yet, but we are looking at very low doses of THC that we wouldn't expect to be analgesic on its own, in combination with different doses of the terpenes, as well as in combination with low doses of opioids. But we haven't thought to integrate cannabidiol in yet, just because the study is pretty long as it is. But cannabidiol would be an important next step.
Okay, thank you so much. We are a little bit out of time, but I think it was an interesting discussion, and we started this day because we wanted to discuss, and therefore I hope you all agree that we have a short break. Please be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much.